"You don't belong here." The words hung in the air, cutting deeper than any insult. At a glamorous wedding in the Hamptons, Jasmine, a successful black businesswoman, found herself facing humiliation in front of 300 high society guests. What began as a night of celebration quickly turned into a battle for respect as Jasmine was forced to confront the very people who believed they could tear her down. But here's the twist. Jasmine wasn't going to let this slide. With one powerful decision, she was about to turn the tables and leave everyone speechless. Betrayal, defiance, and the sweet taste of justice were just around the corner. Don't miss out on the full story. Hit that subscribe button now and let us know where you're watching from. What will happen next? Stick around and get ready for an unforgettable ride. The sharp clink of glasses echoed in the opulent ballroom as Jasmine stood at the threshold, eyes scanning the glittering crowd. The chandeliers overhead shimmered, casting a soft golden hue over the polished marble floors. The scent of roses mingled with the faint aroma of champagne. Guests, dressed in expensive suits and gowns, moved in clusters, laughing and chatting, their voices blending into a dull hum of superficiality. She felt the weight of their gazes before she even entered, their eyes flicking over her as though she didn't belong here. She adjusted her sapphire dress, its luxurious fabric clinging to her curves. But it didn't feel like enough. She could feel their judgment like a palpable force in the air. David, her boyfriend, walked beside her, his hand holding hers. His touch was warm, but his silence was an ever-present shadow. The lack of reassurance stung more than the glaring glances. She forced a smile, the edges of it trembling. "Everything's fine," she whispered to herself, though her heart pounded in her chest. As they stepped deeper into the crowd, she could feel the murmurs. The words, though hushed, were sharp. "She doesn't belong here," she heard one woman say. Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. Not again. She was no stranger to the whispers, the sideways glances, the doubts about her place in this world. She had fought her entire life to get here. But this wasn't just any wedding. This was the wedding of David's brother James, a man she had only met a few times. And while she had hope for some semblance of acceptance, she could already feel the chasm between them widening. James, the golden boy, had always been the perfect son, the kind of man who could walk into a room and be adored by all. And then there was Jasmine, from Brooklyn, from a food truck, from a place no one here would ever truly understand. "Let's just get through this," David murmured, his grip tightening around her hand. His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened her sense of isolation. She didn't want to just get through this. She wanted to thrive. She tried to stand tall, but the weight of the social divide pressed down on her chest, making every breath a struggle. As they made their way past the tables draped in silks and the waiters balancing trays of caviar, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. The rich, decadent atmosphere clashed with the grit of her upbringing. She had built her catering empire from a beat-up truck, slinging spicy jerk chicken to late-night crowds who didn't care about social status, only about good food. But here, at this wedding, in this sparkling palace of high society, she was an outsider. She was the woman who didn't belong. They reached their table, seated in a far corner, away from the heart of the family. It was like being put in the back of the room at a party, a deliberate exclusion, an unspoken reminder of where she stood. "They put us with the distant cousins," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She could feel the sting of the words, but she didn't let them show on her face. David's jaw tightened. "It's fine. Let's just sit down." He sat first, pulling out her chair for her, but his actions, though kind, didn't ease the growing frustration inside her. Why wasn't he fighting for her? Why wasn't he standing up to this blatant disrespect? Her gaze darted across the room, landing on Victoria, David's mother, standing near the bridal party. The sequined gown she wore caught the light, her posture rigid, her smile sharp as she directed a photographer to capture Emily, the bride. "Make sure you get every angle of Emily's elegance," Victoria's voice rang out, thick with condescension. "She's the star today." Jasmine's stomach twisted as she watched Emily, James' bride, glide across the room, the picture of grace and wealth. Her porcelain skin, her delicate features, she was everything Jasmine wasn't, everything Victoria would want for her son. And Jasmine, the outsider, was a glaring contrast, standing in the background like a blemish on this flawless scene. As Jasmine turned her head to look back at David, she caught his gaze for a brief moment. His eyes were apologetic, but the words of comfort she longed for never came. "Keep your head up," he whispered, squeezing her hand tighter. But that was it. No fire, no fight, just a quiet, resigned acceptance. The wedding ceremony began, and Jasmine tried to focus on the vows exchanged between James and Emily. But her mind kept drifting back to the cold, dismissive attitudes of Victoria and the rest of the guests. As the photographer called for family photos, Victoria turned to Jasmine with a smile that was anything but warm. "Aisha, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "this is for immediate family only. You understand, don't you?" The words were like a slap to the face. The photographer hesitated, sensing the tension in the air, but Jasmine's throat tightened. She clenched her fist beneath the table, feeling the weight of her humiliation. "Later isn't enough," she hissed to David, her eyes blazing with anger. "She's humiliating me, and you're letting her." Her voice was low, but there was no mistaking the venom in it. David flinched, guilt flashing across his face. But before he could respond, Victoria's voice sliced through the tension once more. "Oh, Aisha, don't sulk. It's unbecoming," she sneered, the cruel laughter of a few guests echoing in the background. Jasmine's world shrank. Every laugh was a reminder of her place in their eyes. She stood, her heart racing. "I need air," she muttered, her voice tight with rage. David reached for her, but she slipped away, weaving through the crowd and out into the garden. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it offered no comfort. The jasmine flowers around her only seemed to mock her. Her mind raced. 5 years ago, David's father, Charles, had sold the family home, erasing the last traces of his first wife without so much as a word. That betrayal had driven her to cut contact with them, and now she was swallowing the same poison. But then, something caught her eye. It was her team, her catering staff in their crisp black uniforms, moving efficiently through the garden. Maria, one of her most trusted employees, was directing them with precision. A jolt of recognition shot through her. Maria worked for her. Jasmine's pulse quickened. How was her company involved in this wedding? What was going on here? Her grip tightened around her phone. "Whatever is happening, I'm about to find out," she thought, determination burning in her chest. They thought she was nothing. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The tension in the air was thick as she made her way back to the reception, her mind swirling with possibilities. As she walked back into the ballroom, the laughter and chatter around her felt like distant noises, a blur of high society ignorance. She felt the weight of their stares on her skin, but this time she didn't falter. She would face this. Head on. The cold breeze cut through the garden, mingling with the faint scent of jasmine. Jasmine stood at the edge of the patio, her hands clenched at her sides, still feeling the sting of Victoria's words. The night had fallen quickly, casting long shadows over the manicured lawn. It should have been beautiful, peaceful, but her heart pounded too loudly in her chest. Every step back into the ballroom felt heavier, like the weight of the evening was settling on her shoulders, pressing down until she could barely breathe. She had hoped the night would be different. She had hoped she could stand here, alongside David, without feeling like an outsider. But every glance, every word, every laugh, reminded her that this world, this life, wasn't hers. It never would be. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her pulse. The soft sound of laughter and clinking glasses leaked through the open doors as she approached the threshold of the ballroom. The room was filled with soft golden light, and guests mingled in the middle, their voices rising and falling like the hum of bees in a garden. The air was thick with perfume and expensive cologne, and the soft rustle of silk and tulle filled the space. Waiters were moving with practiced precision, trays of caviar and foie gras, their gloved hands steady as they offered them to the guests who barely noticed. Jasmine's stomach twisted as she stepped back inside. She tried to hold her head high, but the weight of the stares, the disapproving glances was crushing. It wasn't even the coldness of Victoria or the sneers of the others that hurt the most. It was David's silence. His lack of defense, his unwillingness to stand up to his family left her feeling utterly alone. "Let's find our seats," David said, his voice low, his hand gently guiding her through the crowd. They reached their table, the corner table, as if they were an afterthought, placed far from the family, away from the center of attention. The glittering centerpiece, with its expensive silver and crystal, stood in stark contrast to the dark corner where they were seated. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, searching for something to latch on to, but all she saw were faces that didn't look at her with kindness. Her gaze landed on James, David's younger brother, the groom laughing with Emily, his bride. The two were perfect, radiant, flawless, the epitome of everything that this world demanded. Jasmine's stomach twisted in knots as she watched them, realizing just how alien this space was to her. Victoria was near them, her eyes flicking over to Jasmine with a subtle sneer. She was talking to another woman, her voice sharp and dismissive, cutting through the noise of the celebration. Jasmine had learned a long time ago to ignore the whispers, to push through the sideways glances. But tonight felt different. The weight of it all pressed down on her. She had worked too hard to get here. She had fought her way through every door that had been slammed in her face, every laugh that had been aimed at her, and yet here she was, still fighting, still proving herself to people who would never truly see her. David sat down beside her, but his attention was elsewhere, his eyes scanning the room. He had retreated into himself, leaving her to navigate the storm of judgment alone. She could feel the tension rising in her chest, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Every passing moment seemed to stretch longer, and the more she tried to focus on the ceremony, the more her thoughts kept drifting back to the harsh words of Victoria, the coldness of James, and the deep, aching silence from David. The ceremony began, but Jasmine couldn't focus. She forced herself to watch, to smile at the appropriate times, but her mind kept wandering. The vows being exchanged between James and Emily felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't struggling to hold back tears and rage. As the photographer called for family photos, Jasmine's gaze flicked over to Victoria, who was standing at the center of the bridal party, directing everyone with a practiced smile. "Make sure you capture every angle of Emily's elegance," she said, her voice sharp, commanding. She was the queen of this world, the one who controlled the narrative, and Jasmine was just an outsider looking in. When the photographer turned toward Jasmine, Victoria's smile faltered for a moment before it was replaced by a sugary, sweet expression. "Aisha, dear, this is for immediate family only," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You understand, don't you?" Jasmine's throat tightened. The blood rushed to her head, and for a split second, she felt like she might choke on the anger rising inside her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, those same eyes that had been watching her since she walked in. They were waiting, waiting for her to break, to crumble under the pressure. But she wouldn't. Not this time. She forced a smile, but it felt hollow. Her eyes darted to David, who was still seated, still silent. His gaze was apologetic, but the lack of action, the lack of support, was louder than anything he could have said. "Later isn't enough," she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. "She's humiliating me, David, and you're letting her." David winced, but he didn't speak. He only looked at her, his expression torn, but ultimately weak. Jasmine's fist clenched beneath the table. This wasn't the man she had imagined herself building a life with. She didn't need his apologies. She needed him to fight for her, to stand beside her in the face of this cruelty. But instead, he withdrew further into himself, unable or unwilling to do what she needed. Victoria's voice broke through her thoughts again. "Oh, Aisha, don't sulk," she said, her tone coated with false concern. "It's unbecoming." The laughter of nearby guests rippled through the air, sharp and mocking. Jasmine felt the room close in on her, felt the weight of their judgment pressing in. She couldn't take it anymore. "I need air," she said through clenched teeth, standing abruptly and excusing herself from the table. David reached for her, but she pulled away, weaving through the crowd toward the garden. The cool night air hit her like a slap, and for a moment it cleared her head. but it didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding in her head. Why was she here? Why had she come to this wedding, only to be reminded that no matter how far she had come, she would always be an outsider? But then something changed. A flash of recognition in the distance. It was her team, her catering staff, moving with practiced precision. Maria, one of her most trusted employees, was coordinating everything with the same calm authority she had seen so many times. The realization hit her like a jolt. Her company was here. It was her company providing the catering for this event. The tables of caviar, the trays of lobster, the wine flowing freely. All of it was because of her. Her heart skipped a beat, a surge of power rushing through her veins. They thought they had all the control. They thought they could push her aside, make her feel small. But they were wrong. With newfound resolve, Jasmine pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling. She needed answers. This night, this wedding, it was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. Not Victoria, not Charles, not anyone. She turned back toward the ballroom, her heart thudding in her chest. The game had changed, and this time, she wasn't backing down. The cold air outside was no relief. Jasmine stood by the stone pillar, her breath visible in the night, but the shock still rattled her insides. Her heart was racing. The garden had gone quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees. Her phone felt heavy in her hand, almost as if it were a lifeline to something she hadn't fully grasped yet. But now it was clear. She needed answers. She had stepped away from the chaos inside, the oppressive weight of Victoria's insults, the crushing silence from David, and the sting of her humiliation. But the truth was, she wasn't just any guest at this wedding. She wasn't just someone who had been invited as a plus one or a token outsider. No. Her company, Coleman Catering, was the one making this event possible. The food, the service, the staff, all of it. It was her empire. As she pressed the phone to her ear, the familiar sound of Maria's voice crackled through. Maria, Jasmine's voice was tight but controlled. Why is my company here? The words left her mouth with an urgency she hadn't expected, but she couldn't ignore the cold edge of the situation. I didn't know we were catering this event. Who booked it? Maria's response was quick, but there was a pause before she spoke again. Well, Aisha, She stumbled for a moment, as if searching for the right words. There's been a change. A while ago, we acquired a smaller catering company. This wedding came with it. I didn't know you'd be here. A quick surge of disbelief shot through Jasmine. Her company, her pride, was here, at this event, under her nose, and she hadn't known about it? She had put everything into building Coleman Catering from a modest food truck into a name known by New York's elite. She had fought tooth and nail to prove herself, and now she was facing not just disrespect, but manipulation. Silent, insidious manipulation. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the phone, her breath shallow. So, you're telling me that this wedding, this entire event, is under my company's contract? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of the realization. And I didn't authorize it. Another silence. Then Maria answered, her voice apologetic but firm. Yes, the event's contract was inherited with the acquisition. It was all signed by the previous management, but legally, it's ours now. The realization hit Jasmine with full force. The event was hers. She owned it. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was in control. For the first time that night, a sense of clarity broke through her anger. She wasn't powerless. She had the power to end this, to turn everything around. The thought sparked something within her, a fire that had been buried beneath layers of humiliation and frustration. She took a deep breath, the weight of her thoughts pressing in on her, and yet for the first time, she felt a shift. This wasn't just a random wedding. This was a chance to make a statement, a chance to reclaim her dignity. With a steady hand, Jasmine typed a quick message to Maria. I need a full rundown of the contract. Now. Everything. She hit send before slipping the phone back into her clutch, her eyes narrowing as she turned back toward the building. The doors of the ballroom swung open, and the clinking of glasses and distant chatter still seeped out. She could feel the pulse of the music from inside, the laughter, the mingling. Everything was so far removed from her world, the world she had built from the ground up, the world where every plate served, every dish perfected, had been a small victory in itself. But this was different. This wasn't just about food anymore. This wasn't just about catering for a room full of people who never bothered to see the woman behind the empire. This was personal. Jasmine's heels clicked sharply against the stone path as she walked toward the building again. She had made a choice, and she would see it through. She was done being the quiet observer, the outsider at the table. The same people who had turned their backs on her would soon realize who they had underestimated. She made her way to the back of the ballroom, where the staff doors were slightly ajar. The familiar faces of her catering team were moving quickly, expertly managing the event. But Jasmine noticed one thing. They weren't just serving, they were working. Working for her, even though none of them knew what was about to unfold. The world of high society may have dismissed her, but Coleman Catering had been serving them, unnoticed. They were all eating from the fruits of her labor, from her vision. And now she was about to take back what was rightfully hers. As she approached, Maria spotted her, and immediately her eyes flicked to Jasmine's face. There was hesitation, a flash of surprise, and then the composure of a professional who had seen too many surprises in her time. "Aisha," Maria said, keeping her voice low, but there was an unmistakable tension in her tone. "Everything is running smoothly. We're prepared for the final course. What's going on?" Her voice betrayed a subtle confusion, concern even, but Jasmine only nodded. She wasn't here for questions. She was here for answers. "I need the details of the contract, Maria," Jasmine said, her voice firm, not allowing any softness in her tone. She wasn't playing games anymore. "Everything. Get it to me now." Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then nodded, already reaching into her pocket to pull out a set of papers. "I'll have it to you in 10 minutes, she replied. That was all Jasmine needed to hear. She turned on her heel, walking back toward the main hall, her mind racing. The shock was starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculated sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the contract, about a wedding. This was about respect. It was about showing everyone who had ever doubted her that she wasn't just some woman from the wrong side of the tracks. She was someone who had fought and clawed her way to the top. And she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. The soft murmur of voices from inside the ballroom reached her as she walked through the door. The guests were still laughing, toasting, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The photographer was moving between tables, catching the perfect angles of the bride and groom. But Jasmine wasn't looking at them. She wasn't looking at the table of distant relatives. She was looking at Victoria, standing proudly near the center of the room, still smug in her perfect little world. And Jasmine? Jasmine was standing at the edge of it all, but she wasn't a stranger anymore. She was a player, and soon they would all learn who she was. The night had only just begun, and the tables were about to turn. The power was in her hands now, and there was no going back. The cold air outside was no relief. Jasmine stood by the stone pillar, her breath visible in the night, but the shock still rattled her insides. Her heart was racing. The garden had gone quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees. Her phone felt heavy in her hand, almost as if it were a lifeline to something she hadn't fully grasped yet. But now it was clear. She needed answers. She had stepped away from the chaos inside, the oppressive weight of Victoria's insults, the crushing silence from David, and the sting of her humiliation. But the truth was, she wasn't just any guest at this wedding. She wasn't just someone who had been invited as a +1 or a token outsider. No, her company, Coleman Catering, was the one making this event possible. The food, the service, the staff, all of it. It was her empire. As she pressed the phone to her ear, the familiar sound of Maria's voice crackled through. "Maria," Jasmine's voice was tight but controlled. "Why is my company here?" The words left her mouth with an urgency she hadn't expected, but she couldn't ignore the cold edge of the situation. "I didn't know we were catering this event. Who booked it?" Maria's response was quick, but there was a pause before she spoke again. Well, Aisha, She stumbled for a moment, as if searching for the right words. There's been a change. A while ago, we acquired a smaller catering company. This wedding came with it. I didn't know you'd be here. A quick surge of disbelief shot through Jasmine. Her company, her pride was here, at this event, under her nose, and she hadn't known about it? She had put everything into building Coleman Catering from a modest food truck into a name known by New York's elite. She had fought tooth and nail to prove herself, and now she was facing not just disrespect, but manipulation. Silent, insidious manipulation. Jasmine's fingers tightened around the phone, her breath shallow. So you're telling me that this wedding, this entire event, is under my company's contract? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of the realization. And I didn't authorize it? Another silence. Then Maria answered, her voice apologetic but firm. Yes, the event's contract was inherited with the acquisition. It was all signed by the previous management, but legally it's ours now. The realization hit Jasmine with full force. The event was hers. She owned it. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was in control. For the first time that night, a sense of clarity broke through her anger. She wasn't powerless. She had the power to end this, to turn everything around. The thought sparked something within her, a fire that had been buried beneath layers of humiliation and frustration. She took a deep breath, the weight of her thoughts pressing in on her, and yet for the first time she felt a shift. This wasn't just a random wedding. This was a chance to make a statement, a chance to reclaim her dignity. With a steady hand, Jasmine typed a quick message to Maria. I need a full rundown of the contract. Now. Everything. She hit send before slipping the phone back into her clutch, her eyes narrowing as she turned back toward the building. The doors of the ballroom swung open, and the clinking of glasses and distant chatter still seeped out. She could feel the pulse of the music from inside, the laughter, the mingling. Everything was so far removed from her world, the world she had built from the ground up, the world where every plate served, every dish perfected, had been a small victory in itself. But this was different. This wasn't just about food anymore. This wasn't just about catering for a room full of people who never bothered to see the woman behind the empire. This was personal. Jasmine's heels clicked sharply against the stone path as she walked toward the building again. She had made a choice, and she would see it through. She was done being the quiet observer, the outsider at the table. The same people who had turned their backs on her would soon realize who they had underestimated. She made her way to the back of the ballroom, where the staff doors were slightly ajar. The familiar faces of her catering team were moving quickly, expertly managing the event. But Jasmine noticed one thing. They weren't just serving, they were working. Working for her, even though none of them knew what was about to unfold. The world of high society may have dismissed her, but Coleman Catering had been serving them, unnoticed. They were all eating from the fruits of her labor, from her vision. And now she was about to take back what was rightfully hers. As she approached, Maria spotted her, and immediately her eyes flicked to Jasmine's face. There was hesitation, a flash of surprise, and then the composure of a professional who had seen too many surprises in her time. Aisha, Maria said, keeping her voice low, but there was an unmistakable tension in her tone. Everything is running smoothly. We're prepared for the final course. What's going on? Her voice betrayed a subtle confusion, concern even, but Jasmine only nodded. She wasn't here for questions. She was here for answers. I need the details of the contract, Maria, Jasmine said, her voice firm, not allowing any softness in her tone. She wasn't playing games anymore. Everything. Get it to me now. Maria hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then nodded, already reaching into her pocket to pull out a set of papers. I'll have it to you in 10 minutes, she replied. That was all Jasmine needed to hear. She turned on her heel, walking back toward the main hall, her mind racing. The shock was starting to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculated sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the contract, about a wedding. This was about respect. It was about showing everyone who had ever doubted her that she wasn't just some woman from the wrong side of the tracks. She was someone who had fought and clawed her way to the top, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. The soft murmur of voices from inside the ballroom reached her as she walked through the door. The guests were still laughing, toasting, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The photographer was moving between tables, catching the perfect angles of the bride and groom. But Jasmine wasn't looking at them. She wasn't looking at the table of distant relatives. She was looking at Victoria, standing proudly near the center of the room, still smug in her perfect little world. And Jasmine? Jasmine was standing at the edge of it all, but she wasn't a stranger anymore. She was a player, and soon they would all learn who she was. The night had only just begun, and the tables were about to turn. The power was in her hands now, and there was no going back. The night had been simmering with tension, the air thick with it. Jasmine had felt it when she first walked into the ballroom, the cold glares of the elite, the whispers that lingered in every corner. But now, with every passing second, it was like a bomb ticking away, ready to explode. She stood at the edge of the room, just inside the door, her eyes scanning the crowd. The guests were still mingling, their laughter echoing off the marble floors, but beneath the surface there was a growing unease. Jasmine had done it. She had pulled the trigger, activated the plan that would flip this whole evening upside down. The catering staff was already working diligently, delivering trays of food to the long banquet tables. But Jasmine knew something they didn't. What they were serving wasn't just food. It was a message that couldn't be ignored, no matter how hard they tried. The wedding was about to fall apart, and the guests had no idea that the very thing they had come to celebrate would turn into their undoing. Her fingers gripped her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made the call. The food was no longer hers to serve. The trucks were already rolling out, carrying with them the best of what Coleman Catering had to offer. No more caviar, no more lobster, no more champagne. There would be no main course. The guests wouldn't even see it coming. The silence that had fallen over her in the last few moments was broken by the sound of the servers moving toward the grand table, setting down plates, but there was something wrong. The waiters began to look around, exchanging confused glances, and Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. They were too late. The trucks had already pulled out of the driveway. The food had disappeared, just like her patience had with the way David's family had treated her. She couldn't help but smirk, though it felt hollow. This was it. The moment when everything she'd been forced to endure was going to shatter their perfect world. The tension in the air was palpable. The servers were at a standstill, unsure of what to do, as empty plates were set down on tables where hungry guests stared in confusion. A murmur spread through the room, quickly rising into a clamor of whispers and disgruntled comments. Jasmine's eyes flicked to Victoria, standing with that smug expression, oblivious to the chaos she had inadvertently helped trigger. She didn't know yet, but she would. In moments, she would. Jasmine couldn't wait for the look on her face. That feeling of power surged again, but it didn't come with the satisfaction she expected. Instead, a sinking feeling filled her chest. She was about to burn a bridge, and while it was a necessary move, the consequences would be real. She could already hear the raised voices, the irritation bubbling into anger. She glanced at the exit, knowing that soon the wedding's perfect veneer would crack and the truth would come spilling out. She could almost see William storming over, his face red with rage, while James, the groom, stood frozen at the center of it all. This wasn't how he had imagined his wedding day, but it wasn't her fault. This was their doing. They had made her feel invisible. They had made her feel like an outsider. Now they would know what it felt like to be powerless. As Jasmine took a step toward the main table, the room's atmosphere shifted. The laughter died down, and a few heads turned as Charles, David's father, entered the room, his eyes scanning the scene. His expression shifted as he noticed the commotion. Guests were whispering, servers were stammering, and still, the food wasn't being served. The silence grew unbearable as Charles took in the empty plates. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp, cracking through the tension like a whip. A waiter stuttered, trying to explain, but the words got caught in his throat. Jasmine could see Victoria's eyes widening as the realization hit her. Something was wrong. Her face hardened into a frown, her perfect mask beginning to crack. Charles turned toward her, his eyes narrowing, his anger building. "What happened to the food?" he snapped, his voice growing louder. The chaos had begun. Jasmine stood there watching it all unravel. For a brief moment, she wanted to let the storm consume them, to let the weight of her decision crush them as it had crushed her for so long. But the truth was, the storm wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Victoria, now visibly shaken, stepped forward to confront one of the waiters. "Where's the main course?" she demanded, her voice now sharp, cold with fury. The waiter could only shake his head, at a loss for words. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. This was her moment. Victoria approached the nearest table, her hand twitching as she grabbed a glass of wine and took a long sip. But it was clear. The situation was spiraling out of control. "They've messed up everything," she hissed, her voice rising with every word. "This is unacceptable." The whispers from the guests grew louder, and Jasmine could see the confusion turn into frustration. The food they had been promised was missing, and there was nothing to fill the gaping hole left in its place. Jasmine could practically taste the fear in the air. The elite of Manhattan, standing at the epicenter of their spoiled evening, were realizing just how quickly things could unravel. "Get the manager," Charles barked at a nearby staff member, his voice now trembling with rage. Jasmine didn't wait to hear more. She knew it was time. This was the moment. Maria would soon arrive with the contract in hand, and with it, she would deliver the final blow. She took one last look around the room, at the guests now standing awkwardly by their untouched plates, their faces twisted in irritation. David was still sitting at the table, his gaze flicking nervously between his father and his mother. His jaw was clenched. He looked like a man torn between loyalty to his family and the reality of his failing relationship with Jasmine. But Jasmine didn't care about that now. There was no room for uncertainty anymore. She glanced back at the door, the staff beginning to disperse as the wedding turned from a celebration into a circus of confusion. She could almost hear Victoria's sharp words cutting through the panic, telling the manager that this was all a mistake. But it wasn't. This was no mistake. This was a consequence. The clattering of silverware rang in her ears as a few guests began to murmur complaints. One woman, a socialite with a diamond necklace, turned to her friend and muttered, "$1 million wedding, no dinner. What a joke." Jasmine's lips curled into a smile. Victoria had always been the one to dictate the narrative, but tonight that would change. Tonight Jasmine would not be overlooked anymore. As Charles stormed toward the kitchen, furious, James stood frozen, his face pale with the realization of what was happening. The perfect evening had turned into a disaster. Jasmine's lips trembled for a moment, but she steeled herself. This was her doing, and it wasn't over yet. Jasmine had pushed the button that started this chain of events, but now she wasn't just standing by. She was owning it. The air in the ballroom had shifted, thick with tension and confusion. The once smooth flow of the evening was now interrupted by frantic whispers, guests' angry murmurs, and waiters who had nothing to serve. Jasmine could feel the weight of it all. The disaster she had set in motion had unfolded faster than she could have imagined. But as she stood in the middle of it all, a quiet sense of satisfaction crept into her chest. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by the sound of clinking glasses, the uneasy shuffle of feet, and the increasingly desperate attempts of the staff to salvage what was left. The power dynamics had shifted, and Jasmine stood at the center of the storm, no longer a spectator, but a force that would be reckoned with. Victoria had yet to realize the magnitude of the chaos, but it wouldn't take long. Her poised exterior had begun to crack as she looked around the room, her face betraying the discomfort she was trying to suppress. It was as if the entire world she had worked so hard to build, the world of wealth, control, and superficiality, was slipping through her fingers. And Jasmine could see it. She could feel it. From across the room, she noticed Lillian, Victoria's sharp-eyed counterpart, gliding toward her with a purposeful stride. The gleam of her sequined gown shimmered in the chandelier light as she approached, her expression one of utter disdain. The woman was a queen, used to ruling over her domain with a smile. But Jasmine could see the tightening of her jaw, the flicker of frustration in her eyes. Well, Lillian's voice cut through the crowd, carrying more weight than any of the hushed whispers. I suppose this is your idea of making an entrance. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she met Lillian's gaze with an intensity that matched her own. Her pulse was steady, every inch of her body bracing for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. The room was still buzzing, but it seemed to fade into the background as Lillian stood before her, her eyes narrowing. You think you can ruin everything, don't you? Lillian's words were sharp, laced with a bitterness that was almost too much to hide. This is a wedding, not some street show for you to perform. Do you know what you've done? Jasmine's lips tightened, but she didn't give an inch. I didn't ruin anything, Lillian. I just showed you what happens when people underestimate me. Lillian's eyes flickered with irritation. Oh, please. You think you've won something? This? This is a disaster. I know exactly what you're trying to do. You're desperate for attention. You think that because you're a businesswoman, you can walk into my world and disrupt it? It doesn't work that way. Jasmine's gaze was unwavering. She could feel the weight of Lillian's words, but they were hollow. The woman in front of her represented everything that had held her back, everything that had made her question her worth. The high society, the entitled, the people who believed that money and power gave them the right to dismiss others. Jasmine had spent her entire life fighting against that mindset, and now, standing in the middle of this chaos, she was finally seeing the results. I don't need your approval, Lillian, Jasmine replied, her voice calm but firm. I've built something that matters, something real, and I'm done letting people like you think they can control me, control anyone. Lillian scoffed, stepping closer, her eyes full of venom. You think you're something special? You're a woman playing at being a queen. A catering company is not the empire you think it is. You're nothing more than a cheap showpiece. And when this all comes crashing down, I will make sure everyone knows just who you are. The words hit, but they didn't break her. Jasmine stood tall, her shoulders squared, her resolve only strengthening. She had been underestimated before, time and time again. But this time, there was no going back. She wasn't going to let Lillian or anyone else tear her down. Not tonight. You're right about one thing, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. This will come crashing down, but not because of me, because of you. You and your family have played this game long enough, Lillian, and I'm not just here to show you up. I'm here to make sure you see what happens when you push people too far. Lillian's expression darkened, her lips curling into a sneer. You think you can destroy everything I've worked for? You're a fool. You'll never be able to play in my league. Jasmine's mind raced, the events of the night flashing before her. She had spent so many years fighting for her place, clawing her way to this point, and now, standing face to face with Lillian, she knew she had already won. The power was in her hands. She controlled this night. The wedding, the food, the chaos. It was all her doing. And in the end, it would be her name that everyone remembered, not Lillian's. The clamor in the ballroom was getting louder, the guests now openly complaining, some even leaving. Charles had finally come out of his rage-induced stupor and was barking orders at the staff, trying to salvage whatever he could. But Jasmine's focus remained solely on Lillian. The woman in front of her was a relic of the old world, a world that Jasmine no longer needed to apologize for being a part of. She was more than that. She was more than what they had ever expected her to be. Lillian took a step closer, her voice low, almost threatening. You don't understand what you started. When I'm done with you, you'll be nothing but a memory. Jasmine's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I don't think so. Not this time. Before Lillian could respond, Maria appeared at the door, holding the contract. She stepped toward Jasmine, her expression unreadable. But Jasmine could see the slight edge of unease in her eyes. Maria handed over the papers, and for the first time, Jasmine felt the full weight of what she had done. The moment of no return had arrived. I've got it, Jasmine said, her gaze flicking briefly to Lillian. And this is where it ends, Lillian. Not just for you, but for anyone who thinks they can control me. Lillian glared at her, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She had made her move. Now it was time to let the consequences unfold. With a calm breath, Jasmine turned on her heel, leaving Lillian standing in her wake. The ballroom was a wreck, the guests still in disarray, but Jasmine felt a sense of quiet triumph wash over her. This was only the beginning. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the power had shifted, and Jasmine was the one in control. The room had become a battleground. The once pristine elegance of the wedding was now a chaotic mess. Guests milled about, their faces twisted in confusion and frustration. The clinking of glasses and soft murmurs were now punctuated by raised voices and the hurried footsteps of waiters scrambling to salvage what little they could. Jasmine stood at the edge of it all, her heart racing with adrenaline. Yet there was a stillness inside her. The decision had been made. She had already struck her blow. The satisfaction of watching the chaos unfold was overshadowed by a nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was about something deeper. The betrayal, the silence from David, the sting of being an outsider in a family that should have embraced her. Jasmine's gaze swept over the room, and for a brief moment she caught sight of James, his face pale, his expression one of disbelief. Beside him, Emily stood, her eyes wide, glancing between her husband and the destruction that surrounded them. Jasmine knew the moment was coming. She could feel the weight of their gaze on her, the tension in the air like a storm on the horizon. They would come for her. The question was not if, but when. It didn't take long. As if on cue, Emily's voice broke through the murmur of the crowd, soft but firm. Aisha. Jasmine turned, her pulse quickening. Emily was walking toward her steps deliberate, her face a mask of both concern and confusion. James was a few paces behind her, his hand hovering at his side, as though unsure whether to step forward or stay back. But Jasmine didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not now. Aisha, Emily repeated, her voice softer this time. There was an almost apologetic edge to it, as if she had been practicing the words, preparing for this very moment. I need to talk to you. Jasmine stood frozen for a beat, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Emily's approach was genuine, but the past few hours had shattered her perception of who was on her side. Jasmine wasn't sure if this was an olive branch or a judgment, but either way, she wasn't going to make the mistake of trusting easily. I think we need to talk too, Jasmine replied, her voice low but not unkind. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Emily stopped, her face softening slightly, though there was still an air of uncertainty in her posture. I'm sorry, Emily said quickly, her hands fidgeting nervously. I should have said something earlier. I should have stood up for you when Lillian did what they did. I'm sorry it got to this point. Jasmine felt the sincerity in her words, but the pain was still fresh. It wasn't just about Lillian's cruelty. It was about the silence from everyone else. Emily had stood there watching it happen and said nothing. Jasmine had been forced to endure the insults without a single person stepping up to defend her. You're sorry now? Jasmine's voice was steady, but there was a sharpness in it. She wasn't going to let her guard down so easily. Where were you when your mother-in-law was calling me names? Where were you when they made it clear I wasn't welcome? The words stung as they left her mouth, and for a moment, Jasmine saw a flicker of guilt cross Emily's face. She had been silent, and in Jasmine's eyes, silence was just as damaging as cruelty. I was frozen, Emily admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Look, I know it's not enough, but I told James I was wrong. I told him I shouldn't have let it happen. I shouldn't have let my family treat you that way. Jasmine could hear the sincerity in her voice, but that didn't change the fact that Emily had allowed it to go on for so long. The betrayal still lingered like a bitter taste in her mouth. She could see Emily's remorse, but it wasn't enough to undo what had already been done. I've fought my whole life to get here, Emily, Jasmine said, her voice low but powerful. I didn't come from money. I didn't have connections or a family to lean on. I built my company with my own hands, with my sweat and tears. And now, because of who I am, because of where I come from, I'm treated like this. You don't understand what that feels like. To have your worth questioned every single day. To be made to feel like you don't belong. She stopped herself, taking a deep breath to steady the rage that was beginning to rise in her chest. Emily looked like she was going to say something, but Jasmine raised her hand to stop her. She didn't want to hear more apologies. She didn't want words, she wanted action. She needed to feel like there was something more than empty regret. I need you to understand this, Emily, Jasmine continued, her voice stronger now. I'm not just going to sit here and take it. I'm not here for your sympathy. I'm here because this is mine. This wedding, this disaster, it's mine. And I'm not going to let anyone walk all over me, not anymore. Not your mother, not your father-in-law, not David. James shifted uncomfortably behind her, and Jasmine noticed his conflicted expression. He wanted to say something. She could tell, but he was holding back. Jasmine's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time she met his gaze. The guilt on his face was evident, but there was no action. He wasn't fighting for her. He was standing in the shadows just like everyone else. I didn't ask for this, James, Jasmine said, her voice quieter now. I didn't ask to be humiliated in front of hundreds of people. And yet, here we are. I didn't ask for your family's acceptance, but I did ask for respect. And if I'm not going to get that, I'll make sure the world knows who I am, whether you like it or not. The room seemed to stand still as her words hung in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Emily looked like she was about to speak again, but Jasmine raised a hand, signaling that she didn't want to hear it. Look, Jasmine said, taking a step back, I don't expect you to understand, but I will not be anyone's doormat. I've spent too long fighting for a seat at this table. So if I have to make you all understand, if I have to burn this whole thing to the ground, I will. The silence was thick. James didn't say anything, his mouth opening slightly as if he were about to argue, but then closing it just as quickly. Emily's gaze softened, but the tension remained. She didn't know what to say, and Jasmine knew there was nothing she could say to fix it. Just don't make it worse, Emily finally whispered, her voice heavy with regret. Jasmine shook her head. It's already worse, Emily. But this is what happens when you ignore the truth for too long. She turned and walked away, her steps measured, her heart heavy with the weight of the choices she had made. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. But now Jasmine had finally found her voice, and she wasn't about to let it be silenced again. The soft hum of New York's skyline felt strangely distant as Jasmine sat in the cool, modern loft she had built from nothing. The city lights flickered outside the window, but the view did little to ease the tight knot in her chest. The wedding was over. The storm had passed. Yet the quiet aftermath left a hollow space that no amount of success could fill. Her phone buzzed on the table in front of her, a constant reminder of the choices she had made, the consequences that still rippled through her life. The messages were piling up, texts from Emily, a call from James, but Jasmine didn't touch the phone. Not yet. She couldn't. There was too much at stake, too much unresolved. The night of the wedding, when she had turned the tables, when she had finally found her voice, felt like a distant dream now. The chaos was over, but the fallout had only just begun. She could still see David, his face pale with the weight of his guilt, standing at the center of the disaster. His eyes had followed her as she walked away, but there was no attempt to stop her. No call for her to stay, to explain. Just silence. Silence that had been so deafening, it had driven a wedge deeper than she could have ever anticipated. And yet it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who had learned that standing by wasn't enough anymore. But that didn't make it any easier. Jasmine's mind churned as she thought about their conversation earlier, the words she had spoken to him in anger. I needed you there, she had told him, and he had heard her, had promised her that he would do better, that he would fight for her, not just for them, but for everything they had built together. But could she believe him? Could she trust that this time he would be different? The sound of the doorbell pulled her out of her thoughts. It was a soft, almost hesitant ring, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure if they should even be here. Jasmine stood up slowly, her mind still tangled in the web of everything that had happened, everything that still felt like it was hanging in the air, unfinished. When she opened the door, James stood there, his posture stiff, his eyes unreadable. He looked like a man who had been through a storm of his own, his face marked by a mix of regret and confusion. Behind him, Emily lingered, her expression softer, but just as conflicted. Jasmine didn't invite them in. She didn't need to. This conversation was inevitable. Aisha, James began, his voice unsteady, his eyes locking with hers. I'm sorry, I should have been there for you. I should have said something when it mattered. He glanced at Emily, then back at Jasmine, as though he were waiting for some kind of permission to continue. I let my mother and father push me into a corner, and I let them treat you like that. I was weak. Jasmine took a breath, but the words caught in her throat. James was standing here, apologizing. Sincerely, she could feel it. But it was too late. Words, no matter how well-meaning, couldn't erase the way he had stood by while his family had torn her down. His regret now felt hollow, like a bandage on a wound that had been left to bleed for far too long. I don't need your apology, James, Jasmine replied, her voice tight with frustration. What I need is action. I need to know that when it counts, you'll choose me, not them. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. Not after everything. Emily stepped forward, her hand resting on James's arm, her eyes filled with a mixture of empathy and guilt. She's right, James. We both know that. But we want to do better, Aisha. I want to be better. I've seen how hard you fought to get here. I've seen what they did to you, and I know it wasn't just about the wedding. It was everything that came before it. You deserve so much more. Jasmine looked at Emily, her gaze softening slightly. The sincerity in her voice was undeniable, and for a moment, Jasmine wondered if maybe this was the beginning of something real. But even then, doubts crept in. Emily had stood there silent as the insults flew as the pain mounted. She had let Lillian push Jasmine to the brink, never once stepping in to defend her. Could Emily change? Or was this just another mask, another attempt to fix what was already broken? You've seen nothing, Emily. Jasmine's voice was quiet but sharp. You've seen the result, but you haven't seen the years I've spent proving myself. I've fought my way through every door that was slammed in my face. But when it came to your family, to you, I was just a thing to be tolerated, a charity case to be pitied. And now you want to be sorry? It's not enough. It will never be enough. Her words hung in the air between them, harsh but true. Emily flinched, but James didn't back down. He was standing there, his jaw clenched, eyes determined now. I know it's not enough. I know I can't undo what I've done, he said, his voice low. But I can try, and I will. If you let me, I'll stand up for you, Aisha. Not just today, not just now, but from here on out. I'll prove it to you. Jasmine felt a spark of something she couldn't quite name, flicker in her chest. It was hope. It had to be. But she quickly crushed it. Hope had been her enemy for so long. Hope was what had made her stay in relationships, in situations that had only hurt her in the end. She wasn't going to let hope blind her now. She met James's gaze, her own eyes hardening. I'm not asking for you to fix everything, James, she said slowly. I'm asking you to stop hiding. I'm asking you to stop being their puppet. Because if you can't do that, then I can't be here. A heavy silence followed her words. The weight of the moment, of everything unsaid, seemed to press in on them. James's expression flickered, something like pain, like a man who knew he was on the verge of losing something he didn't fully understand until now. I don't want to lose you, Aisha, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do whatever it takes. I swear. Jasmine's gaze softened, just for a moment, but she quickly turned away, her emotions threatening to overtake her. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. I'm not asking for a promise, James. I'm asking for the truth, Jasmine said, her voice steady. And the truth is, I've been alone in this for so long, I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. Not even you. She turned toward the door, ready to face the future she had fought for, alone if she had to. She was done compromising, done waiting for someone to change for her. Jasmine was going to move forward, no matter who was beside her. Goodbye, Emily. Goodbye, James, she said softly, her heart heavy but resolute. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two of them standing in the hallway, words unspoken, feelings unresolved. Thank you so much for following along with this journey. We hope Jasmine's story has sparked some thoughts or emotions within you, whether it's about strength, trust, or the courage to take control of your destiny. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how you would have handled the situation. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new story. We'll see you next time. Until then, stay bold, stay true to yourself, and keep fighting for what you deserve.